Greetings, respected viewers. This video is about the new president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and his past, what to expect from him. And I'll probably mispronounce his surname, so I shall try to refer to him as Emmerson. Forgive the excessive familiarity, or just simply the president. So he has got a rather unflattering sobriquet, the crocodile. Not a good one. He shares that with P.W. Botha, a comparison I don't think he would favour, Botha having been the last president of South Africa to uphold apartheid before F.W. de Klerk consigned it to the dustbin. So Emmerson Mnangagwa, his age might be as great as 75 or 72. I'll come on to why we're unsure about his date of birth. So he was in ZANU from the early days, the Zimbabwean African National Union from the 60s. It was a black nationalist group who believed that the majority race should control the country. It's hard to dispute the logic or the rectitude of their cause. And they had tried a softly approach with the white-dominated government, and peaceful protest was met with them being imprisoned. Their organisation was outlawed. So push finally came to shove, and they used force. If they hadn't done that, then the racist system probably would have lasted a lot longer, might even be there today. Reasoned argument was not working on its own. Anyway, Emmerson, he led an attack on a train, he was captured. He claims to have been severely tortured by the Rhodesian security forces. That may well be true, and he would have been executed, but he was under 21, so his life was spared. Now, when Emmerson was in the Zimbabwean security apparatus, being under 21 certainly wasn't enough to save somebody's life. It shows that the old racist system was actually more compassionate than what Emmerson put in place. So he spent 10 years in prison. Conditions, however bad they were in prison, didn't prevent him from studying. He later went to Zambia, where he qualified as a lawyer. But he still helped the Chimurenga, as they called it, the uprising. I know Ian Smith's illegal government tried to say, oh, this is communist-inspired. And as governments often do against rebellions of this sort, try and say their machinations behind the scene, it's China or the Soviet Union pulling the strings and other African countries are conspiring against us. Anything to distract attention from the fact that it was a popular insurgency, and try to claim that it wasn't because it had foreign backing, as though that would delegitimize it. Of course, Smith had some foreign backing as well from South Africa, and indeed from some people on the right of the Conservative Party in the UK. So many black civilians were killed by ZANU PF's army at the time, and ZAPU's as well, just because they were working for whites, and the Rhodesian army killed lots of civilians too. No nation has a pathogenesis. Even if one is fighting in a righteous cause, often acts of turpitude are carried out, something which both sides would like to overlook, but then overemphasize the malt in the other person's eye. Anyway, we know that there was a deathbed conversion to some modicum of racial equality from the Rhodesian government in 1978-79, and Bishop Abel Muzorewa would like to say it was because of him. He was like Jesus, meek and mild, he loved his enemies. But these baby steps towards equality were only because Smith had a gun to his head. So being reasonable didn't seem to work. If Smith had made those concessions in the 60s, perhaps not a single person would have died, rather than 20,000. Anyway, Emmerson Mnangagwa, he served in various government positions. He was a confidant of Mugabe for half a century. And remember in the early 80s, Mugabe's name re-echoed the length and breadth of Africa as a hero. He was seen as a moral titan. So people were singing glad hymns of praise to him. Gukwarhundi, I'm probably mispronouncing it, occurred. This attack on the Matabeles, and that minority was massacred. That's one of the notable things about the early ZANU government, is their extraordinary magnanimity towards former foes and their egregious savagery towards their erstwhile allies, ZAPU. Notice about 20,000 civilians killed by the Zimbabwean security forces in the 80s. Contrast that against the Sharpeville massacre and the Soweto massacre. These massacres carried out by the South African security forces, which undoubtedly occurred and were rightly condemned around the world, and South Africa was a moral pariah for that. However, when crimes on a much greater scale were committed by a black nationalist government, the Organization for African Unity stonewalled. According to Mugabe, these things were not happening at all, despite human rights organizations having very well documented records of them, despite survivors' accounts and all these eyewitnesses and church groups saying so, despite the mass graves. Eventually, the evidence was too great to deny, and Mugabe had to say, well, you'll always have one or two tiny incidents, and it was brushed off as a triviality. Mnangagwa was a securocrat all through this time, and he tried to say the army was culpable, not the Central Intelligence Organization. So he's involved in internal repression, and that was really giving a royal thumping to peaceful and legal opposition to the regime. So one of his former opponents in a constituency said he's a very cruel man, and ZANU-PF's youth wing almost burnt to death one of his opposing candidates. There'll be no trial for Mugabe, and I know why, because who would the star witness have to be? Emmerson, who was involved in all this. And Mugabe will say, well, actually, you should ask Emmerson about that, and he was president, and he was part of this. You can't try me if you don't try him. I'm not sure if the president has sovereign immunity. They say a deal was done, $10 million for Mugabe, and immunity from prosecution, which hasn't been too strenuously denied. So if Mugabe were put on trial, it would create presentational difficulties for the new head of state. So Emerson's immediate priority has got to be to repair the tattered economy. This 51% law may have to change. 51% of any enterprise is to be owned by a Zimbabwean, and I think a black Zimbabwean at that. There are a few Indians and whites, and that's putting off the Chinese investors. The currency, are they going to have a new one, go back to the US dollar, or what? There are various payoffs to make. It was the military who forced Mugabe to step down. It wasn't a military putsch. Well, as the saying goes, if it looks like an elephant, it walks and it talks like an elephant, then it's probably an elephant. So real elections would be nice, though I don't wait with bated breath. I suspect the ZANU-PF coterie will continue to rule, as they've done for 37 years. The MDC has been split. They were effectively neutralised by bringing them into coalition in 2008, which I didn't think improved the situation much. The situation was so dire, I gave it a chance and thought it would be better if they did that, but I don't think it actually improved things, sadly. There's very little hope, and that's why so many Zimbabweans have fled. So I hope this isn't a false dawn. People ask me, and I'm not a Zimbabwean, nor have I ever set foot on Zimbabwean soil, but though I am reasonably well clued up on its affairs. So Emmerson got off to a bad start because he set the tone by going out of his way to heap laud on his predecessor, Mugabe. So what else will happen? Will he bring some of the commercial farmers back and restore their property? Just possibly. Things couldn't really get worse. I'm very worried he's going to waste more money by increasing military salaries as a thank you to those who put him in there. Is there actually going to be an election where his rule is somehow validated? Because he wasn't even vice president when he was shoehorned into office. So that's that. I don't expect dramatic changes or dramatic improvements, and I desperately want to be proven wrong.